Hello and welcome to another episode of the TLDR podcast. I'm Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined today by Rory Taylor.
Hello.
I didn't know what your formal title was. I keep forgetting it sort of changes. Anyway, in today's podcast, we are going to be looking at, I think, mainly the sort of Tory response to ever-declining polls and the fact that they seem to have at least sort of implicitly given up on the campaign, which isn't unprecedented. But before we get into that, I just want to do a little plug for the newspaper. I don't think I was sufficiently enthusiastic last episode, but I just want to really stress that I really do think that it was actually a magazine this time around, the Too Long magazine. It really is going to be a great product. And as I said last time, I think quite a lot of the time when we do our normal videos, it's like sort of fundamentally critical, or we're looking at bad stuff that happens at sort of like crises. We're never really talking about in constructive terms about how things might get better or how to possibly fix stuff. And one of the reasons I really do like the magazine is that at least when it comes to the UK content, it is going to be quite constructive. It's going to be about whether or not Labour can fix the UK's various structural crises. And you're sure you're supporting the channel, but you're also investing in your own knowledge. You know, that's great value. You're paying to make yourself smarter. Anyway, if you would like to buy the newspaper, please go over to there's a link down below. And the code is too long. Embarrassingly, we don't know the code. So the code will come up on screen here.
And it'll be in the description.
For £2 off. I think it's £2 off. Okay, so with all that being said, let's get into the main bit of the podcast. Before we do the main story, as is custom on this podcast, we are going to do our favourite campaign moment since we last did the podcast, so in the past week. Rory, what has been your favourite campaign moment?
I have a few, and I think one of them might clash with yours, so I'm going to go with my other one.
Go for it.
This is Nigel Farage revealing that Reform paid, I think it was £144,000 to a vetting company to vet their candidates, and apparently no work was done, and that's been quite evident by the number of Reform candidates who've, various past statements, tweets, all these things have come up.
This is a man, by the way, who claims he can save £50 billion a year by trimming government waste.
Yes, yeah.
So there's an irony there.
Yeah, so I just thought that was quite a fun little moment.
Yeah. I do. It's just such a recurring problem for all the sort of various pre-incarnations of Reform. UKIP had the same problem when they kept on finding out that their candidates had some sort of slightly questionable past.
Yeah, and especially with a very short timetable for this election, it was really exacerbated that issue.
I think mine, and this is going to lead quite nice onto the main bit, but mine has been the chaotic messaging on social media by the Tories. It really, in the last couple of days, people who've been following British politics closely will know that it feels like Rishi Sunak's social media team have just had like a sort of a psychological breakdown. I mean, they're just sort of posting weird, almost like motivational quotes. So on the Twitter, there was this quote where there's that we shouldn't be buying foreign food. By British.
Yeah.
It's very Liz Truss. I don't know how people remember. She gave that weird speech where she said it's a disgrace that we're buying French cheese.
We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
And then at the same time, over on Facebook, and I guess there's different target audiences, which maybe explains this, he was posting sort of like screenshots of Margaret Thatcher quotes about socialism and about how, socialists are bad and that sort of thing. Not only is it just a bit odd and a bit B-tech, I just don't think that has any purchase. Like, in terms of the discourse, it's not like the sort of Keir Starmer as a socialist really lands in any meaningful sense.
It's this strange thing where, it's not actually Rishi Sunak sat at his computer going, I'm going to put this Margaret Thatcher quote up, I'm going to say, buy British food. But it's a strategy. Actually, I think it's worse that it's actually a strategy devised by people on his team, I think.
We talked about this, me and Ben, on the last episode, but I do think this goes back to this fundamental issue about institutional incompetence, which is that there comes a point as a party when it's just not attractive to work for that party. It's just not good on your CV. And so if you're a sort of young, upstart, social media savvy Politico, you're not going to sign up to work for a losing Tory campaign. And so you're going to get some, let's just be frank, some goon who's just taking advantage of it and plonking out some random quotes.
And then it always ends up, on Twitter at least, the Buy British one will get community noted saying, under the Conservative government, imports of foreign food has gone up by X% or something. And it's almost asking for these things to happen. And I don't think it will make that won't make a difference to the actual to the to the election result, but it is symbolic of what's happening in the campaign, I think.
Before we just slide into wildly criticising the Tories, let's just cut off this campaign moment bit and get straight into the main story.
Oh yeah, because I forgot that was just
I think
So that was meant to be the fun opener.
And I think this is sort of fed in quite nicely. But in the main bit, we want to talk about the sort of change in tone from the Conservative campaign. I'd say it's sort of taken place over the last week or two. I think a couple of weeks ago, you saw some Tories basically trying to spook former Conservative voters back to voting Conservative by saying that if you vote for Reform or the Lib Dems, you're going to hand Keir Starmer this dangerous. I mean, the term of the phrase they're using is supermajority, which is sort of an American import, but doesn't really have any purchase in the UK because, well, it might do. I mean, it's meaningful insofar as obviously the polls are currently suggesting that Keir Starmer would have a massive majority, and that would give him a bit more license, a bit more ability to do whatever he wanted, given that there couldn't really be a functional rebellion against him with that massive majority. But obviously in the UK system, it's not like in certain other systems where, for constitutional amendments, you need a 2/3 supermajority. If you have a majority in the House of Commons, you can basically do anything. I mean, that is just the way it works. Nonetheless, that is the attack plan they're going for. You've seen it pick up a little bit in the last couple of days. There was a Tory spokesperson, I think today, basically using the term, or number 10 spokesperson, using the term supermajority and saying you have to vote Tory to get, to guarantee against a Keir Starmer supermajority. I think this is interesting for two reasons. I mean, the first is most obviously, it suggests that they've already given up. Which is, I mean, that is unprecedented. I don't think we've ever fought a campaign like this.
Yeah, I'm sure there have been campaigns where internally they know that and they have been basing their campaign around trying to just sort of shore up their base and be as strong in opposition as they can. But you wouldn't see that sort of be a public face of the campaign. That is an odd decision. And I think Grant Shapps was one of the first cabinet ministers I noticed to actually start saying, look, this is about having a strong conservative opposition to a Labour government. Whereas now, I think more people have said it, and it is effectively the line that Conservative Party campaigners are being told to use. So it's definitely just gone from being a sort of thing that one or two people are saying to being the strategy now, I think.
Well, I think it actually started with Farage, because I think Farage was the first person to basically explicitly say, look, Starmer's won this election.
Yeah, and he and on top of that, he's sort of not really been that interested in attacking Keir Starmer or Labour.
No.
Beyond, the moments in debates and things, but he is aiming all his fire on the Conservatives because he, like the Conservatives, effectively knows that the polls suggest that it's over for them, basically.
And I also think this points to his longer-term plan, which I think is pretty clear now, is to take over the Conservatives.
Absolutely.
And so, it's in his interest to make sure they have the worst possible result.
Yeah.
The other reason I think this is interesting is I just think it's very much an open question as to whether or not it's an effective tactic. I think it's telling here that Nigel Farage is also using the same thing. It's saying that Keir Starmer's already won. But he clearly thinks it's an effective tactic for Reform voters. I mean, he clearly thinks the sort of next step in voters' minds from Keir Starmer has won is there's no point voting Tory.
Yeah.
Whereas the Tories are hoping the next step in voters' minds is Keir Starmer has won. Oh, let's hope I don't give him a supermajority. And I just think that I intuitively agree with Farage, as insofar as I think it's not an effective campaign tactic if you're trying to, boost the Tory vote. I think if you're sort of hovering Tory voter and you hear Sunak say Starmer's won, don't give him a supermajority, I think you're more likely to go, actually, if Starmer's already won, I know that if he's got a majority, he can basically do whatever he wants. The difference between a sort of 100-seat majority and 200-seat majority in practice is zilch. I'm going to, use my vote to protest against the Tories. I'm going to vote for whoever I think ideologically best represents me. Probably, in many cases, Reform. In fact, polling suggests something like 3 to 4 in 10 2019 Tory voters are currently going Reform. So I just don't think it'll be an effective tactic either.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's a sort of an interesting parallel, I think, in the US where Donald Trump was saying, every time Donald Trump in a campaign says the election's rigged, the Democrats are going to steal it, that actually has a suppressing effect on his own voter turnout because it makes them think, well, what's the point? Why should I go out and vote? And it's not a perfect parallel, but I think there's a similar effect with this strategy that the Tories are going for. But
I guess the other question is, do they have a better strategy then? I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah,
is that
I don't know. It's tricky.
It is tricky
because what they need to do is try and just consolidate their base and try and come out of the election in as strong a position as is possible, but can they have that as their internal strategy without making it obvious to people that they've sort of given up? I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in their defence, there is something just sort of at its face disingenuous about someone like Sunak saying, no, I can still win the campaign. I'm still in it to win it. Like, you did see that in the early stages of the campaign when there was already a 20-point lead, when he was going on radio shows and being like, no, I still think I can win. And that was always met with like a bit of a smatter. It was just sort of very silly. Yeah. So I guess he's probably hoping that there's a sort of honesty dividend to this strategy, to just admitting, look, I know we're doing badly, the polls are bad, but please don't give Starmer a super majority. But I don't really think it works at all.
No, especially now we're 2 weeks away.
I know it's all gone very, very quickly.
It's really quick.
There's really not much time
also,
for things to change.
I sort of, maybe we'll come on to this, but I feel like nothing has happened in this campaign. There's been a lot of sort of fun, well, I suppose the Farage stuff has been something and the Tory decline has been another thing, but it just doesn't feel like it's been an eventful campaign.
It's felt too short in a way. And one of the reasons I think this has really benefited Labour is actually it's really benefited their play it safe strategy, because playing it safe, you know, as people start to interrogate your positions and try and push back on some of your, like, well, when it comes to Labour, basically push back on some of the tax and spend stuff, be like, well, how can you really fix all the structural problems if you've ruled out basically every big tax rise? It takes a couple of weeks for that to really like filter through to the voting public, and then people start asking, like, oh, actually, how are you going to do this? And then force Labour to like unveil their plans. But Keir Starmer has been to just sort of tread electoral water for 4 weeks, and he probably will be able to for the next 2 weeks by just sort of fudging his way through things. And I think that has actually really helped Labour. I think in a longer campaign, it would have been harder to maintain that sort of ambiguity where you're simultaneously saying, look, we'll stick to Tory spending plans, but then also, no, don't worry, we're going to fix all the big problems. We're going to get growth to highest in G7, all that sort of thing.
I used to be of the opinion that the calling of the election in July instead of like October, November wouldn't actually have had much of a difference on the result. But now, so today, day of filming, the Bank of England have maintained the base interest rate, and they said, or that they implied that they're going to cut it in August, I think. Yeah. And that's a big factor that could have been good news for Sunak.
Inflation came down. Yeah. We got to 2% basically.
Yeah, so I'm starting to come around to the view that had they just waited till the autumn, I still think the result would have been fundamentally the same, but it could have been a less bad result for the Conservatives had they waited.
No, I think that's something that's a point we often forget, the counterfactual, the relevant counterfactual here. And you're right, actually, that now that we know how the inflation data has panned out, I mean, I think the inflation data, the fact that it was lower, sort of comes hand in hand with the weak growth data. There is a relationship between those two statistics. And so, like, whether or not weak growth electorally offsets any electoral gains you might get from falling inflation or inflation reaching target is an open question, I think. But I sort of do sympathise. I sympathise with your basic point. I actually think that the timing wasn't right. Although I do see his reasoning if you're just looking at purely the economic stuff, because it's true that when he called the election, inflation was looking a bit stickier than people had forecast, and it was refusing to sort of come down from about 3%. So I can see where he's coming from that one. And I also do think the other thing that's probably underpriced here, and that if we're sort of imagining what would happen if it held it later, is the small boats thing, and the fact that small boats have sort of started ticking up above their 2022 high now, as in sort of like year to date, as in like at this point in 2022, mid 2022, there were slightly fewer small boats than there have been this year. There was a decline in 2023, but 2022 was a record year, and it looks like 2024 will be even higher. And I think that would have provided Farage with even more ammunition going into the election. I also just think that as the numbers went up during the summer, sort of the media's focus would have turned back onto that, and that might not have helped him. So I think this one of the other questions that I wanted to ask you is, and I think I sort of gave my answer here, which I think they've played it quite well. But how do you think Labour have played this campaign, given how short it's been and how little has sort of happened?
Yeah, it's funny because if you just look at the campaign period, since the election was called to now, I feel like Labour haven't really done that much. Most of what Labour has done in the lead up to this election has been, in the months and years before the election was called. It's been this long process that Keir Starmer has talked a lot about, changing the Labour Party and all of that. People have heard it before. But the fact that when they published their manifesto, there was basically no nothing that surprised us, no big bombshells or anything. It as you say, it really is a play it safe strategy.
One of the things I thought when I was rereading the manifesto is I think they've done quite a good job of laying the groundwork for some more radical-ish policies.
Yeah, there are things where they've absolutely ruled things out, but there are other things where they've left the door open, basically, haven't they?
Well, that's on taxes, but I mean more like they've done quite a good job of sort of like pre-preparing both the electorate and the media, and also actually sort of like anticipating Tory attack lines for some of their more headline grabbing policies.
Right.
I'm thinking of stuff like rail nationalisation.
Yeah.
Although that's more complicated. They're not nationalising the rail. It's not that simple. It's not really a sort of public-private binary there. It's more like they're sort of slightly nationalising parts of it. They're ending the franchise system. But anyway, and then like Great British Energy is another good example. Like, those are quite radical policies. They are markedly distinct from the Tories. But Labour have done such a good job of sort of like wearing them in that when they formally announce them via the manifesto, they don't get a whole lot of like media pushback. And that the Tories don't have that line of, look, this is old school socialism.
That's what they'd been talking about for months.
Yeah, their big policies. They've sort of normalised them. They've normalised like slightly radical policies so that when they come out, they feel boring, but there's still enough ideological space between them and the Tories.
Yeah.
To their credit, basically. I think in retrospect, I think that they've been savvier than I gave them credit for. I thought they'd been too boring, but I actually think that there's some pretty big stuff in the manifesto.
Okay. I think in terms of the play it safe strategy, what frustrates me is that I understand that Labour have the most to lose when you look at what the polls say. But I do think when you're talking about a so-called supermajority of 500 seats, well, not a majority of 500 seats, but if you're going to win between 400 and 500 seats based on polling, I think that does give you some room to be a bit more radical on anything, basically. But if the Tories and the Telegraph and this sort of right-wing media are to be believed, Keir Starmer will come in and absolutely fundamentally change the country into what do they say, one-party socialist state or something? I think that's a slight exaggeration, but I mean, if they do win a majority of that size, they in theory they can kind of do anything, really.
But I think, again, and I don't know how conscious this was by Labour, and maybe it's just luck, maybe it's just all the cards are falling in the right way for Starmer, which does seem to be the case at the moment.
He is an incredibly lucky man.
The fact that he's going to just get these numbers, I mean, he's no Tony Blair, let's be honest.
No, I mean,
and he's going to end up with the most enormous majority.
Yeah, he's got Nigel Farage sort of taking the Tories out on the right. The SNP are collapsing in Scotland, which is great for Labour. Sunak's campaign has just been
Sunak's just an awful campaigner.
Yeah.
Me and Ben had this argument like 3 years ago, and I'm so glad I was right. But
and the fact that they're trying to defend 14 years of their government record while also sort of saying, no, Sunak was a fresh start. That all of this just makes Keir Starmer's job so much easier.
A very friendly Lib Dems as well. Yeah. Davy's been pretty explicit that he's not really competing against Labour. It's more against Tories. Also, quite a weak Green Party, which I do think is relevant. I mean, you're not seeing like a Germany or like a sort of late 2010s France situation when the Greens did very well there.
Also,
squeezing.
I think the media has also been incredibly friendly to Labour this election, and I think it's quite remarkable because you can just see that the press they just know that the Tories are on the way out. They don't need to be, so they don't need to defer to them at all anymore. That there are a lot. I'm not trying to say Keir Starmer hasn't been scrutinised at all, but he is having a lot of an easier ride than previous Labour leaders between 2010 and now, and that's because I think the media has sort of accepted the narrative that the Tories are on the way out and they don't need to, they can just pick up on any little thing Sunak does and have a go in for it.
Well, this is the thing I think that we keep coming back to, and I do think this is sort of the underlying logic of this election, is that at a certain point, once the polls have gone so wide, I did think they would narrow, and me and Ben had this argument, but I think Ben was right that actually once polls got to a certain point, the leading politician, in this case Labour, slips into sort of virtuous cycles where the media, big business, they all know they're coming in, so they all buddy up to them. Labour get more funding now, they get more donations, and they get a better treatment by the media because the media want to make sure that they have good relations with the incoming government.
And it's sort of an uncomfortable truth, but it is absolutely the case.
Yeah,
I mean, you just saw just this week or last week, this sort of wealthy Tory donor has switched to Labour now, and he was on the airwaves explaining why, and it's not always out of the goodness of their own hearts or anything. It's quite strategic.
And one of the things I liked about that story, by the way, is that sort of like, the token British billionaire. And like in America, it's always something like, an arms dealer or something like that. And our guy is the guy who founded Phones for You.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's nice and provincial, just very British.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the converse I was going to say is that then the losing party or politician, again, in this case, the Tories, get stuck in a series of doom loops, And I think one of the ones that was, there's the funding issue. Obviously, donors stop donating because what's the point in donating to a losing party? There's also the treatment by the media. We talked about this about the ITV interviews that the media almost start taking the piss out of Sunak now.
Yeah.
There's no respect because there's no threat. What's the problem? But then I also think that one of the things you sort of forget is that when the polls get really, really bad, even your big beasts have to start campaigning their local constituencies, which means you have no national presence.
Yeah.
Like you've got Jeremy Hunt campaigning in Surrey.
Talking about like pylons and power masts. You think this is the Chancellor.
Yeah. And he's really worried about losing his leafy Surrey seat.
Yeah.
So he has to be doing that. And that just means and even Sunak now, the latest YouGov MRP poll thinks that he'll lose his seat.
Yeah.
He'll probably have to go back and fight in wherever
Richmond.
it is. Richmond. And so I just think that partly explains why at the moment the Tories just really don't have much of a national presence.
Yeah.
I mean, you do, even their sort of like national media appearances do look a bit provincial. Like you saw those videos of, them in Devon, trying to feed sheep or whatever it is. It's not very prime ministerial, and it's quite sort of Ed Davey. It's quite sort of Lib Dem. I don't mean that pejoratively. I love Ed Davey, but it's not what you'd expect from a sort of like incumbent government.
Yeah.
And I think something similar is true on the sort of like virtuous cycle thing when it comes to public opinion, because we've just seen a whole lot of YouGov polling coming out saying that basically everyone thinks that Keir Starmer is by far and away the most prime ministerial candidate out there. And I see that. I think the field is pretty weak. I mean, it's not like any of the alternatives, Sunak, Ed Davey, Farage, really have. I mean, Farage obviously does have a sort of national platform and a national image that sort of predates this election, but it's a very controversial one. He's a very polarizing figure. But the polling suggests that basically the public think that Starmer is by far and away the most prime ministerial candidate. And I do think that is just a function of the fact that we all think he's going to be the prime minister.
Yeah.
I don't actually think he is particularly prime ministerial. I was thinking that in the debates. I mean, this goes back to the conversation we had on the podcast a while ago, which is that what the British public want. Do they want a sort of David Cameron, a very sort of like polished, a very statesman-like figure? Or do they want now someone a bit friendlier, a bit more affable, a bit more relatable, whose dad was a toolmaker, perchance, But I think that you do get this sense where everyone's just anticipating Keir Starmer being the prime minister. They start seeing him in those terms. It's obviously helped by stuff like appearing at the D-Day thing and talking to Zelensky. But once that happens, it becomes sort of default that you tick his name when you go to the ballot box. But yeah, the last question I wanted to ask is, if you mentioned at the start of this little bit that the Telegraph is saying that Starmer will, when he gets in, he'll become sort of lefty socialist and all that sort of shenanigans. Leaving aside like the rhetoric, if Starmer does get in and he does cut taxes or maybe break some of his campaign promises, do you think he'll get away with it?
I mean, he'll get away with it in the sense that it's not going to bring him down sort of early or anything.
Yeah.
I think he'll probably face criticism for it and scrutiny for it, but I don't think it will change the parliamentary arithmetic or anything. And also it wouldn't be the first time that he has rolled back on some pledges that he's made. And they have their lines. They've sort of have an established way of dealing with those criticisms, which is saying, well, things have changed, and they'll probably say it again the next time he sort of breaks a pledge. But I don't. I think if he did it, the idea of getting away with it, I don't know, is sort of a strange one.
It's hard to pin down, isn't it? I guess that's a tough question. Sorry about that. Yeah. I think they've actually made so much about them not raising income tax, national insurance, VAT, all that sort of thing, that I think that if they did it quite quickly afterwards, I think they would receive quite serious pushback. I think also they're trying to be like, their point there is that we're promising stability, we're promising sort of honesty and integrity, unlike the Tories. And I think that would hurt them too early. But you can imagine the first sort of mini crisis that falls their way. I don't know, energy prices go up, or food prices go up or something like that, and they go, oh no, we do need to find a tax from someone.
Yeah.
I think that events will license the sort of tax rises that parts of them
there are some taxes or sort of revenue raising methods that they have so they haven't categorically said they won't raise. So I think those are things they can do before having to go and raise income tax.
I think also they talk actually in quite ambiguous terms sometimes. They're very fond of this turn of phrase that we won't raise tax on working people, working families.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Who's a working family? Like that's just so clearly deliberately ambiguous. The only thing I'll say is that I think a lot of this assumes that they will need to raise taxes to do the stuff they want, and fundamentally that's because I don't think anyone treats Rachel Reeves' claim about growth seriously. When she's pushed in like interviews, like there was a very good woman I thought with on the Rest is Politics. I shouldn't really plug
a rival podcast.
Yeah, I don't know. Rival is a bit grandiose. You shouldn't really plug bigger podcasts.
No idea who we are.
But when she's pushed, she reverts back to this thing that it's growth. You know, we're going to achieve the highest growth in the G7 without really providing detail on how to do it.
Yeah.
To her credit, though, one of the things she keeps on pointing out is that stability in and of itself would be something in the current context. And I do think that especially when it comes to sort of foreign investment, it is all relative. And come the end of this year, we might have a massive 500-seat Labour government, enormous majority, very sort of like steady ship, centre-left maybe, but, fiscally prudent. And then you might have some quite chaotic politics over in Europe. I mean, the German coalition looks increasingly precarious and sort of constantly stuck in a deadlock between the FDP and the Greens. And then in France, depending on the results, I mean, at the moment the polling is insane in France. It could be anyone from a Bardella majority all the way through to a sort of Popular Front majority. And obviously in America, you've got the presidential election coming up, which looks just to be increasingly chaotic and polarizing. And in that international context, it might well be true. Yeah, that actually just being boring and
Who's laughing now?
I sometimes think that we sort of like got out of our system a little bit with Brexit. I do think in many ways Brexit was sort of like our sort of like moment of populism. I don't like that term. I think it's sort of needlessly pejorative. I think it's too sort of like loaded. But just for lack of a better one, I think that was our sort of like populist moment, and I think that has convinced quite a sizable fraction of the electorate that actually boring politics is back. We quite want boring politics again. Whereas I still think that Europe to some extent, and I mean America, I just think has a different political temperament to us. But like
they've had their moment, and they
want more.
Might be doing it again. Yeah.
I keep more and more. I think that there might be something to Rachel Reeves's sort of like basic claim that actually just boring stability is pretty great in the current context. I now sound like a sort of Labour apologist, but I'm not. I'm just my instinct is to be very, very skeptical of anyone who just says like, "Oh, growth is going to save us," and I just want to sort of like at least provide the other side of that argument. Anyway, I think that is enough talking about
all of that.
Yeah. Let's go on to minor parties.
Yeah. I mean, who counts as a minor party nowadays? Basically everyone that's not.
That's so true. Good point.
Yeah.
I want to talk about reform, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
I want to talk about reform for a couple of reasons. This is mainly off the back of their manifesto, because I do think that the reform manifesto in its objective, which is to basically squeeze the Tories in further, is very good, as it were. I basically think that the Tory manifesto, anyone who's in the UK will know this because you probably didn't even see anything about the Tory manifesto when it was released. It was the worst of both worlds. It wasn't radical enough to excite anyone, but it wasn't boring enough to be realistic, or it wasn't boring enough to be sort of like fiscally responsible. Yeah.
Reassuring to its
There was
base.
£17 billion of tax cuts or whatever it was in that. And what Farage has done quite effectively is just actually be the tax cutting party. It's harder to put a number on his tax cuts because they're pretty extreme, and he claims that he's going to fund them all with some wild ideas, a combination of sort of like cutting foreign aid, taxing immigrant workers. To be fair to him, there's a really cool bit. Oh, I don't know. This is really boring for everyone, but I really want to talk about it. There's a really cool bit in the manifesto where he says that we can recoup sort of 30 to 40 billion pounds, actually more like 40 billion pounds, by not paying the Bank of England for its losses on QE reserves. It sounds so boring, but it's actually really interesting, and it's a really politically savvy move. But I think that is one of the reasons that the polling has just gone up. And I do think that it puts the Tories in a really, really difficult position, because I don't know where the ideological space is for the Tories now anymore.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, at the risk of making this too like tenuous a comparison, if you look at the Republicans in France, they were squeezed. They were, one of the two big parties, the main centre-right party in France for a long time. And they, in the last decade or so, were squeezed between Macron's sort of centrist alliance, maybe we can say that's the Lib Dems, and then
this is fun.
National Rally on the far right.
Ed
Maybe we can
Davies,
say
the
that's
English
reform.
Macron.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. It just means their space is a lot smaller and getting ever smaller, and it sort of forces people in the party to think, well, do we just sort of fully group up with the further right, or do we just abandon ship and join the Lib Dems?
Now you've said it, though. I do think that's actually a good analogy. Yeah, great analogy, especially because of how it's playing out.
Yeah.
I mean, we now do have what has actually happened in France. So Ciotti said,
yeah, there is. So his sort of wing of the Republicans has actually formed an alliance with National Rally.
So now the Republicans split.
Yeah,
they are split.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are the other wing of the Republicans doing?
They are just standing as themselves.
Republicans.
Yeah. So there are some seats where you'll have, candidate of the left, the Macron candidate, a Republican candidate, and then a National Rally / dissident Republican candidate.
Well, dissident Republican is a cool name.
Although I don't know which one's the
that's
dissident.
Who's the dissident?
It's sort of a ludicrous situation.
But it is a good analogy, isn't it? I mean, where basically a sort of like established centre right / right wing party has been just so thoroughly squeezed that they've had to go one way or the other. Do you mind if I talk a little bit about the Bank of England stuff?
Sure, sorry, I didn't mean to take you away from it.
No. I just, now that we mentioned it, I do think it's really, really interesting. The reason I think it's really interesting, and also, by the way, it's something that, it's so exciting.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Well, the other reason that I thought I want to talk about it is because you just mentioned the French context. And I think one of the things that was very underappreciated about some of Macron's recent speeches, and this, I think it's worth putting in the context of the sort of French debt crisis, is that he's started talking about providing secondary mandates to the ECB. So what this means basically is that the ECB currently just has one job. Yeah, the European Central Bank is inflation targeting. It's about making sure inflation sticks to 2%. It might have other stuff, but Macron has started talking about, like, I think in the speech he gave where he said Europe could die, he later on in that speech said, we should consider giving the ECB a green mandate. And that would mean requiring that the European Central Bank pursues monetary policy that is conducive to the green transition. Now, it's possible that quietly the ECB are already doing this, because there's been some reports based on the FT that actually the people who work at the ECB, if you imagine who works at the ECB, that they're like university educated, very smart people, they're pretty young in general. They all believe in climate change. They all think it should be a policy priority. And you can fold those concerns and those beliefs into inflation calculations. You can be like, look, if we want to keep inflation down, we need to make sure we don't get climate change, because climate change is inflation inducing. Because it is. Because if you get really bad climate change, you get higher food prices, you get higher fuel prices. That all exacerbates inflation. So, it's possible that the ECB could quietly fold in those sort of like concerns, fold in climate concerns into their existing mandate. But I just think it's interesting that someone as sort of normally establishment as Macron, is talking about sort of repoliticizing in a very specific way, but repoliticizing monetary policy. And in the UK, we had a similar moment about that with Liz Truss and actually Jeremy Corbyn, who didn't talk about it explicitly, but Jeremy Corbyn was keen on something called, tell me if this is really boring. Nigel, you're behind the screen, so if this is really boring, you can just tell me and I'll stop. But he was flirting with something called fiscal dominance, which is basically when you just tell the Bank of England, which is normally independent at the moment, but you could do it without necessarily collapsing Bank of England independence. You can basically like dare the Bank of England and be like, look, I'm going to borrow loads of money and you can either support me or not, but if you don't, everything's fucked. And then the Bank of England might go, oh, bloody hell, he's serious. We're going to have to support him. We're going to have to buy out loads of government debt. And it's called fiscal dominance, and he was flirting with it. But then we had it with Liz Truss, there was a moment in her campaign against Sunak where she flirted with getting rid of central bank independence. which came, this is 1997 is when the Bank of England became independent. All inspired by the Fed, by the way. So European central banks saw that the Federal Reserve was very, very good at its job, apparently, and in the 90s decided to all go independent, and part of the Euro story as well. But anyway, we had that moment, I think because associated with Liz Truss, it just died as an idea. We were like, oh, that's a silly Liz Truss idea, isn't it? But the Farage policy, which is actually very, very trivial in the sort of grand scheme of things. I mean, he's not actually talking about sort of like renationalising the Bank of England or bringing it back into government. He's just talking about a very specific bit of monetary policy. It's really interesting because it's again, monetary policy sort of being touched by politicians. Politicians just like getting interested in monetary policy again. And the reason I think it's interesting is because I think this has just been waiting to happen. The thing with this current setup is that because of basically a series of changes we made in the mid-2000s to how we operationalize monetary policy, we compensate the Bank of England for its losses on government debt, which is when interest rates go up. At the moment, we're paying about about £40 billion a year. We expect to pay £40 billion a year. The reason this is an issue is because when we made these changes in the mid-2000s, we hadn't done quantitative easing. So the central bank, Bank of England, hadn't bought up loads of government debt. So the numbers were tiny. The numbers were trivial. And it was basically about allowing the Bank of England to get a better hold over interest rates in the wider economy. But now it's bought up tons of government debt, which means that when interest rates go up and the value of these bonds goes down, something along those lines.
Suddenly we're paying a huge amount more to
£40 billion a year, by the way, is basically the education budget. It's not far off defence. It's a third to 40% of the NHS. I think those numbers are about right. It's a massive amount of money. And even the people who actually introduced the rule, a couple of former Bank of England Bank of England governors, and some people who are on the Monetary Policy Committee at the time, think it should be amended to at least get a little bit of money back from it. And the point here is that Farage thinks you can get all the money back. That's a more dramatic thing to do. But his basic sort of like point that actually this is a bit of a funky way of operationalizing monetary policy, and I don't think it is really justifiable to be paying absurd amounts of money to a bank that can't go bust in a sort of period of austerity. His basic point is sort of correct. And the reason I think it's interesting is because I don't know if this will get picked up in the next 2 weeks. You can see it getting picked up in the moment in places like the Financial Times. But if it does get picked up in the next couple of weeks, I do think if you're a sort of median voter and someone tells you, look, we're paying £40 billion a year to the Bank of England that can't go bankrupt so that it can pay back sort of losses on reserves that are held in commercial banks. You basically just hear we're paying a lot of money to bankers and they don't need it. And I think that in that framing, it might get picked up in the wider public. And I think it's interesting because the fact that, basically the people who did it agree that it should be amended, but Farage doesn't want to jump on it, means that I think it could be the sort of beginning of the repoliticization of monetary policy in the UK. And I mean, if that does happen, it has enormous consequences. I'm just going to leave it at nice, vague, enormous consequences because I think, it depends on what happens next. But I thought that was the most interesting bit of the Reform Manifesto, and I think he's politicizing something that quite effectively. Whether or not that actually ends up changing any meaningful way will just depend on whether or not the idea gets traction. And that probably depends on how well Reform do in the polls in the next couple of days. But yeah, that was. So I think that it's cool. The Reform Manifesto was cool because obviously it squeezed out the Tories, but I also thought that was an interesting little tidbit. It's also the other thing is that I think it does that classic horseshoe theory of politics, where like the sort of the academic bits of the quite far left is maybe too strong, but people like, for example, Torsten Bell, who's now going to be a Labour candidate but was running the Resolution Foundation, he talked about this a fair bit in the past, and then now Farage on the sort of like anti-establishment right, sort of both picking up the same political hobby horse and running with it.
And when you've got those two sides sort of talking about it, that's usually a good sign for if there is going to be movement on it.
It's true.
If it was just a Farage thing, it would be quite easily sort of dismissed. But I do think there's more like a fundamental thing, which is that
as inflation goes up, maybe it's gone down now, but I think it will probably continue to go up, and public finances are strained, I think politicians will increasingly look towards funky monetary policy as their sort of way out. I think Sunak, I mean, if you imagine you're Sunak at the moment, you feel so thoroughly trapped by the Bank of England. You know, you're sort of desperately begging this independent body, please cut rates, and they go, no, well, you are going to lose this election. You know, like if you're Sunak, that's how you must be feeling. You've seen inflation come down, you're desperately hoping the Bank of England cuts rates, and they're, no, that's okay. And you can see how that would stoke political tension. There was no tension back in the Tony Blair years because inflation was nice and low and things were going fine. But the second inflation ticks back up, and I think this is the first time really since the 90s that inflation has probably ticked back in like the Western world generally. I think it was always inevitable that you were going to see like the beginnings of the repoliticization of monetary policy.
Exciting times.
Very exciting times. That's the sort of thing you can look forward to in the magazine, by the way.
It won't all be that. It won't all be that.
It's all going to be that. It's exclusive monetary policy weekly. That's what we're going to go for. Anyway, thank you very much. Let's do the last bit of the podcast.
What is the last?
We would think about losers. Honestly, it's just so overwhelming that we have to do Rishi Sunak. The polling is so appalling for him. He does look like he could even lose his own seat. And it's the squeeze just continues. I think we're finding out in real time what the floor to the Tory vote is.
Yeah.
The winner, I actually sort of have two in mind. The first, I think, actually is someone we put as a loser last time, which is John Swinney.
Mm-hmm.
I think the polling has actually been surprisingly good for the SNP recently. It does look like they've stabilised at about 35% of the vote, which is quite impressive for a party that has just basically been in scandal for the past year.
It's sort of the opposite to what's happening with the Tories, where we're still trying to see what the bottom of their polling is, whereas we can now see the core SNP support.
Which is really quite high.
Yeah.
You know, I think you talk to, I mean, I don't talk to people in Labour because I'm not a real journalist, but people in Labour do say that they are slightly shocked by how well SNP support has held up, because obviously Labour having their own resurgence, you know, nationwide, not just in the UK, in England, but obviously in Scotland. But then also Scottish Labour are uniquely popular. Anna Sarwar is a popular politician.
Yeah.
And, you know, they have a lot of ammo to fire up the SNP, questionable record on public services, constant infighting, Sturgeon and her husband getting arrested. And then
I think it's interesting because this is obviously a general election campaign. You know, this isn't this isn't an election to form the Scottish government. I think that is better for the SNP because they can say, if you want a pro-independent Scottish voice in Westminster, the SNP is your only choice. Whereas when it comes to actually governing Scotland, that's where their record is shakier. So they do have that benefit in this election.
But it's amazing how well that holds up. Like even in I think in lots of ways independence is not looking very likely in the near future, and yet that still keeps them on 35% of the vote. And it's still their priority. I mean, you saw that in the manifesto, page 1 of their manifesto.
We vote SNP to get an independent Scotland or something like that.
Massive font, too big.
Yeah.
But and that seems to work for them.
So he's one of the winners of the week.
I think in a way the SNP just are sort of the quiet winners in lots of ways of this. You know, I think there was probably a sense, and there's some polls that sometimes suggest the polling in Scotland is very close, by the way. That's why there's massive variation. Part of it is because they haven't released census data for the most, like 2021, which is what the rest of the UK did, which means the MRP polls, which basically use sort of census data to track demographic trends and then come up with constituency-specific predictions. It's not as up to date. It's using 2011 data. Anyway, but the polling is really, really close, which means some pollsters, give Labour 40 seats. Some give them 15 seats, and the SNP conversely get 40 or 15 seats. And I think the fact that the SNP is still more than hanging on, and a lot does depend on the night, is quite a story actually. In a way, they're sort of invincible in lots of ways. And again, you're actually right to compare to the Tories, because the Tories, turns out, don't really have a floor, whereas the SNP have a really quite high floor. The other winner I think I want to mention is Boris Johnson, who, for those of you who follow British politics very, very closely, has been doing some sort of recorded video messages. Have you seen these?
Yeah,
the candidates.
He looks really rough. I don't want to be rude, but he does.
It does look rough, doesn't he? The other thing is that if I listen to a couple of them, they are all identical. Hello, folks. vote for Boris, and in this way he's the right man for the job, and it just sort of switches the names. The reason I think he's on the up is I think the fact that MPs are clearly asking Boris for support suggests that he still does have support or appeal in the parts of the country that Sunak just doesn't. So lots of MPs have asked are basically red wall MPs in that sort of northern area that Johnson successfully sort of infiltrated in 2019. And the other thing is that I think, obviously that in and of itself makes Boris a tempting option for the future, the remnants of the Conservative Party. They'd be looking at what happened in 2019. They'd be, when do we go back to that? The other thing is the rise of Farage, because I think if you want a sort of anti-Farage, but Boris Johnson is the best anti-Farage. Yeah. And we saw that in 2019, is that he was the person who could basically get Farage to step down. I mean, it was done under the guise of getting Brexit done, but it's also because Johnson is just better at appealing to the voters that Farage appeals to than Farage is. And then he's got a wider appeal. That basically the number of people who would vote for Farage over Johnson is very, very small. And I think in a sort of like post-24 context, when the Tories are really in disarray and they're looking back nostalgically at 2019 and they're looking at Farage waiting in the wings, I do think that there's a chance of a Boris comeback. And in a way, he does like a comeback. I mean, he did sort of come back.
It will fundamentally depend on if he wants to or not.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was this thing a couple of days ago where, the news was the Tories are going to roll out Boris Johnson in these places to campaign and blah, blah, blah. And then not long later, it said, actually, he's not. He's going on a second summer holiday. Yeah. And maybe that suggests that he's not interested in a comeback, or it might suggest that he wants as little to do with this campaign as possible, so that if he does come back, he can be claim that he's a break from the past. Yeah. Who knows?
My instinct is, do you think it'd be a good move from the Tories? There's a rationale behind it.
I don't think it's... I see the logic.
Yeah, I see the logic.
But I think the success of 2019, the lessons of the success of 2019 have been slightly...
It's been over-inferred
that it was Boris Johnson's personality
that swung it. Corbyn and
I don't know if that Boris Johnson is sort of the future of the Conservative Party, if that makes sense.
God, that would be desperate, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if we end up with PMQs between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, I don't want to go back to that. Yeah, we've done that.
God, what a horrible thought, actually. That would be
be reversed.
Yeah, it's a horrible idea. Nightmarish. But then also, I guess, it depends what you think the relevant counterfactor is, doesn't it? I mean, if you think this is the only way to save from Farage, then maybe it is the right move. I mean, alternatively, if you think that maybe someone like Tom Tugendhat, who's basically announcing his candidacy, or one of the more moderate Tories can take over, maybe that's better for the long-term health of the Tory party.
Because we talk about Farage and the damage he's doing to the Tories from the right, but also, we shouldn't underestimate the damage that the Lib Dems are doing from the centre, I suppose. But yeah, it's
on the notion of a Boris comeback. I think we can end it there. Thank you very much for watching. Please do buy the magazine; it'd be very much appreciated. Anyway, thank you for watching, and join us again next week.
Bye.
That was cute.
Yeah.